Hello, and welcome to Very Kimberly, the healed side of codependency. I was raised in a very small, very blue-collar town about 30 minutes away from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My mom, Sandy, was the daughter of an alcoholic mother who was the daughter of an alcoholic father. Mom spent the majority of her childhood and adolescence in the foster care system, though she still maintained relationships with her siblings and other family members. And although Mom in her teenage years ended up with a wonderful couple as foster parents who loved her as their own daughter, I still believe her childhood experiences cultivated her mindset and how she saw herself and others. As a child, my mom was that very quiet, shy, and passive little girl. But as I remember her, she was friendly and outgoing, witty and sarcastic, and emotionally observant. She was always willing to sacrifice and fiercely lived a life of service to others. She loved more deeply and profoundly, and in such a raw and real way that it made her literally one of a kind. My mom was my best friend, and the only mortal person in this entire world who has ever really loved me unconditionally. My dad, Barry, on the other hand, grew up in what most people would consider your average 1950s blue-collar family. My grandpa, Clyde, worked as a carpenter in the mill. Grandma Helen was a housewife who was best friends with the lady across the street. And they attended church every Sunday, where Grandpa was the choir director. But see, although my grandparents were genuinely good people who lived a very respectable life, I believe it was that image that became sort of an idol, where they struggled to see themselves and their self-worth outside of how others perceived that image. In other words, how others saw and thought about them was most important, and maintaining that perfect image to the outside world was extraordinarily vital. And my dad didn't falter far from that worldly perspective. I was never really close to my dad when I was a child, because I saw him as just this big angry man. He struggled tremendously to regulate his emotions when people or things didn't go a certain way. My parents would fight constantly, with my dad screaming and yelling, throwing things, or punching dents in cupboards. But yet, my dad also worked hard to provide for our family. He cut the grass of the community park that we lived next to because the borough wouldn't do it and his kids played there. He passed out bulletins at church, and both he and my mom cleaned our church part-time. When I was born in winter in the mid-1970s, my dad worked as a custodian in the same mill as Grandpa, and Mom, like Helen, was a housewife. We lived in an apartment where our church was within walking distance until I was around 4 years old, where my parents bought the house that we lived in my entire childhood. We attended that same First United Presbyterian Church that Grandpap grew up in until I was about 13 years old. Now, what makes my codependency story a little on the unique side is the fact that both of my parents had learning disabilities. I was told by them when I was very young, like 5 years old, I think, that they were considered quote unquote slow because they learned things slower than quote unquote normal people. And I was told that I was normal. And when my younger sister Diana was born and became a toddler, doctor told my parents that she was not only slow, but extremely slow. And so at home, even from the early age of 5, my parents grossly overestimated my capabilities as a developing child. I was the big girl. I had to be. There was no other option. Mom taught me how to do basic things, then let me figure out the rest. I was very much held to the standard of being a little adult. But oh, how I wanted to be a real adult back then. Because see, in my child mind, I could do what I wanted then. What a false fantasy that was. But anyway, my little adult big girlness became a very large part of how I saw myself, because that's how my parents saw me. That's how they identified me, with words or without words. But there was another unspoken identifier that I was not so fond of as a child. See, because I was what my parents described as normal and not slow, this also meant that I was different from both my parents and my sister. My dad often told me that I would have opportunities that my sister never would. And on some level, I believe he resented me for that. He saw himself in Diana, I think. He saw how his older brother, David, was able to achieve things in life that he was always told by his parents that he never could. And so I believe he resented my normalness the same way that he did David's. My mom, on the other hand, saw me as someone who could be everything that she believed she could not be. Smart, strong, brave, and independent. And so even though my parents were calling me normal, on the inside, well, I felt anything but normal. In elementary school, I definitely wasn't treated like a normal kid either. I had my very first experience with a narcissist at the ripe old age of 6 in first grade with my teacher, Mr. Casper. And unluckily for me, I had to endure this man's abuse for not only first grade, but also second and fourth grade. Mr. Casper would hit me over the head with his pen for not getting my math work done as fast as the other kids. He'd bring over the teacher from the other classroom to humiliate me in front of the whole class on how sloppy my handwriting was. And he would pull my pigtail if he felt I wasn't paying attention. Mr. Casper treated me not as if I was normal or smart or even capable. No, he treated me like I was the dumbest kid he ever taught, and worthless. I did struggle to pay attention, often daydreaming, which looking back, I believe was symptoms of ADD. But Mr. Casper would say I was in Kimberly land all the time. However, my grades were not horrible. I mean, of course, there were some subjects I was better at than others, but I don't ever remember completely failing in any subject. So I was the smart kid at home, being overestimated in every single way as a child. But at the same time, I was the dumb kid at school, being underestimated. And I very much did not feel like I was normal in either environment, nor did I have any clue of any identity. Church, however, was where I felt at home and where I felt that I belonged. I was free to be that little girl, and for the most part, free to be myself. I was the granddaughter of the famous Clyde, who grew up singing harmony with his two brothers on his father's radio show. And I inherited his love for music, his love for singing, but also inherited the belief that my value as a person was wrapped up in performance. I hope that you'll join me next time. And until then, this is Very Kimberly encouraging you to keep striving to be on the healed side of codependency.